The amber glow of neon beer signs cast dancing shadows across the weathered wooden floor of the rusty anchor, while the distant rumble of 18-wheelers on Interstate 84 provided a constant backdrop to the evening's quiet desperation. Diana, Shadow Novak, had always found solace in the predictable rhythm of small-town bars. The clink of glasses, the murmur of tired conversations, the blessed anonymity that came with being just another face in the crowd. Tonight, however, that anonymity was about to shatter in ways that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Diana sat alone at the far end of the bar, her back deliberately positioned against the wall, a habit ingrained through 15 years of military service that had saved her life more times than she cared to remember. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had operated in the world's most dangerous places, though most people in Clearwater Falls, Idaho, knew her simply as the woman who worked part-time at Henderson's Hardware and kept to herself. The transition from active duty to civilian life had been brutal. 3 years since her medical discharge, and Diana still woke most mornings expecting to hear reveille echoing across a forward operating base in Afghanistan or Syria. Instead, she found herself in a town of 4,200 people nestled in the shadow of the Sawtooth Mountains, where the biggest excitement usually involved high school football games and the occasional bear wandering down from the hills. Her official military record listed her as Staff Sergeant Diana Novak, 75th Ranger Regiment, with 3 deployments and a Purple Heart earned during a classified operation near Kandahar. What it didn't mention, what couldn't be mentioned in any public document, was her 5-year attachment to Delta Force as one of the military's most effective snipers. Shadow was the call sign she'd earned after her 3rd confirmed kill at over 1,200 meters, a Taliban commander who had been coordinating attacks on coalition forces from what he thought was an impregnable mountain position. The Army had recruited her straight out of high school in Boise, drawn by her performance on the rifle team and her uncanny ability to remain calm under pressure. Basic training at Fort Benning had been a joke. Diana could outshoot most of her drill instructors and navigate terrain that left her fellow recruits lost and exhausted. Sniper school had finally provided the challenge she craved, and her instructors quickly realized they had something special on their hands. Dr. Vanessa Crane, the VA therapist Diana saw twice a month in Boise, had explained that her need for solitude and hypervigilance were normal responses to combat trauma. You spent years in environments where letting your guard down meant death, Dr. Crane had said during their last session. Your brain is still protecting you from threats that no longer exist. But as Diana nursed her second beer of the evening, watching the local crowd through the mirror behind the bar, she couldn't shake the feeling that some threats were very real indeed. The Rusty Anchor was owned by Pete Garrison, a Vietnam veteran who had opened the bar in 1987 with his disability payments and a stubborn refusal to let small-town prejudices drive him out of business. Pete had hired Diana without asking too many questions about her background, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who understood that some wars never really ended. "You're looking thoughtful tonight," Pete said, refilling Diana's glass without being asked. His weathered hands showed the scars of both combat and decades of manual labor, and his eyes held the particular weariness that came from seeing too much violence at too young an age. "Just thinking about tomorrow," Diana replied, which was partially true. She had a job interview in the morning with Mountain Vista Construction, a local company that specialized in commercial building projects throughout southern Idaho. The pay was decent, and the work would keep her hands busy while her mind slowly healed from memories that still visited her dreams. The bar's atmosphere changed subtly when the door opened and 4 men entered. Diana's training kicked in automatically, cataloging details without appearing to pay attention. The leader was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the Rusty Anchor. His companions were dressed more casually, but carried themselves with the particular swagger that came from men who were used to getting their way through intimidation. Pete's expression tightened almost imperceptibly as he recognized the newcomers. "Trevor Caldwell," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Diana to hear. "Nothing good ever happens when he shows up." Diana had heard the name around town. Trevor Caldwell owned Apex Protection Group, a private security company that had recently won several lucrative contracts with businesses throughout the region. On paper, they provided security consulting and personnel training. In reality, local rumors suggested they operated more like a protection racket, offering their services to businesses while making it clear that refusing their help might result in unfortunate incidents. Caldwell approached the bar with his 3 companions flanking him like bodyguards. The man to his left was Mason Briggs, his second-in-command, a former military police officer who had been discharged under circumstances that remained officially classified. Curtis Holden, the largest of the group, had the build of someone who resolved problems through physical intimidation, while Ethan Cross, the youngest at maybe 25, seemed eager to prove himself worthy of running with more experienced predators. "Pete," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of someone delivering a threat wrapped in pleasantries, "I hope you've had time to reconsider our conversation from last week." Diana watched the exchange in the mirror, noting how other patrons suddenly found their drinks extremely interesting. The bar's usual chatter had dropped to whispers, and she could feel the tension radiating from Pete's rigid posture. "I told you then, and I'm telling you now," Pete replied steadily. "I don't need protection services. This place has been running just fine for 35 years without your help." Caldwell's smile never wavered, but Diana caught the cold calculation in his eyes. Pete, you're thinking small picture here. The world's changing, old man. Businesses need to adapt or they get left behind, sometimes permanently." The implied threat hung in the air like cordite smoke. Diana's combat instincts were fully alert now, her peripheral vision expanded to track all 4 men, while maintaining the appearance of disinterested observation. Her right hand rested casually near the folding knife clipped inside her jacket pocket. Not much of a weapon, but she had learned long ago that improvisation was often the difference between survival and becoming a casualty statistic. "I think you should leave," Pete said, reaching under the bar where Diana knew he kept a baseball bat. "We're not interested in what you're selling." Caldwell's facade finally cracked, revealing the predator underneath. "You know what your problem is, Pete? You don't understand how the world really works. Maybe it's time someone taught you." Mason Briggs stepped forward, cracking his knuckles with deliberate menace. "Boss, why don't we take this discussion somewhere more private? Maybe help Pete understand the benefits of cooperation?" Diana finished her beer and stood slowly, stretching as if preparing to leave. Her movements were casual, unremarkable, but positioned her between the 4 men and the bar's back exit. If this situation escalated, she wanted Pete to have an escape route. "Excuse me," she said politely, addressing Caldwell as if she hadn't been listening to their conversation. "Could I squeeze past? I need to use the restroom?" Caldwell looked at her for the first time, his gaze traveling from her worn jeans to her simple flannel shirt, clearly dismissing her as irrelevant. "Sure thing, sweetheart. Just mind your own business and everything will be fine." Diana nodded agreeably and moved toward the narrow hallway that led to the restrooms and the bar's back exit. But instead of continuing past, she paused just out of Caldwell's direct line of sight, positioning herself where she could intervene if necessary while maintaining the element of surprise. Behind her, she heard Caldwell's voice drop to a more menacing tone. "Pete, I'm going to make this real simple for you. Either you sign our protection contract tonight, or tomorrow morning you might find that your insurance doesn't cover certain types of accidents. Would hate to see this place burn down because of faulty wiring or maybe a gas leak." Diana's jaw tightened. She had seen too many bullies in uniform abuse their power, and watching civilians prey on veterans like Pete triggered responses that 3 years of therapy hadn't quite managed to suppress. The smart play was to walk away, call the police from her truck, and let the system handle it. But Diana Novak had never been particularly good at making the smart play when innocent people were in danger. "That's extortion," Pete said,
his voice steady despite the odds. "I've got witnesses here tonight, Caldwell. You can't just—" "Witnesses?" Caldwell laughed, gesturing around the nearly empty bar. "I see a bunch of locals who know better than to get involved in business that doesn't concern them. Isn't that right, folks?" The few remaining customers found urgent reasons to finish their drinks and head for the exit, leaving only Diana hidden in the hallway and an elderly couple in the far corner booth who seemed too frightened to move. Curtis Holden grabbed Pete by the shirt front, his massive hands easily lifting the smaller man off his feet. "Maybe we need to demonstrate what happens to people who don't show proper respect for business partnerships." That was when Diana decided the time of observation had ended. She stepped out of the shadows, her posture relaxed but ready, and cleared her throat. "Gentlemen," she said in the same polite tone she'd used moments earlier, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here." All four men turned to stare at her, their expressions ranging from surprise to annoyance. To them, she was just another small-town nobody who didn't understand the gravity of the situation. They were about to learn how wrong that assumption could be.
Trevor Caldwell turned slowly to face Diana, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to cold calculation. At 42, he had built Apex Protection Group from nothing into a multi-million-dollar operation that dominated the private security market across 3 states. What most clients didn't realize was that Caldwell's success came not from legitimate security services, but from a carefully orchestrated protection racket that would have made the mob proud. "Lady, this is a private conversation," Caldwell said, his tone carrying the patronizing authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Why don't you run along home before you see something that might give you nightmares?" Diana remained perfectly still, her hands loose at her sides in a deceptively casual stance that her Delta Force instructors would have recognized immediately. "I was just thinking that Mr. Garrison here might appreciate some backup. 4 against 1 doesn't seem very sporting." Mason Briggs laughed harshly, stepping closer to Diana with the swagger of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with violence. At 35, Briggs had been dishonorably discharged from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division after a series of incidents involving excessive force and evidence tampering. Caldwell had recruited him specifically because his military background lent credibility to Apex Protection Group, while his lack of scruples made him perfect for their actual business model. "Backup?" Briggs sneered, looking Diana up and down dismissively. "Sweetheart, you're about 5'6" and maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. What kind of backup do you think you're going to provide?" Curtis Holden released his grip on Pete's shirt and turned his attention to Diana, cracking his massive knuckles with deliberate menace. At 6'4" and 260 pounds of muscle, Holden had earned his reputation as Caldwell's primary enforcer through a combination of brute strength and a complete lack of conscience. He had never served in the military, his criminal record had prevented that, but his skills in intimidation and violence made him invaluable to Apex Protection Group's real operations. "Boss, maybe the lady wants to volunteer for a demonstration. Show her what happens when civilians stick their noses where they don't belong," Holden said, his voice carrying the eager anticipation of someone who genuinely enjoyed hurting people. Ethan Cross, the youngest member of Caldwell's crew, shifted nervously between his companions. At 25, he was still trying to prove himself worthy of inclusion in their inner circle, though his stomach often turned at the casual brutality his colleagues displayed. Cross had joined Apex Protection Group hoping for legitimate security work, but had gradually been drawn into increasingly questionable activities by the promise of easy money and Caldwell's manipulative mentorship. "Maybe we should just handle our business with Pete and get out of here," Cross suggested quietly, though his voice carried no real conviction. Caldwell studied Diana with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. Something about her stillness bothered him. Most civilians would have been backing away by now, showing clear signs of fear or at least nervous energy. Instead, this woman stood like she was carved from stone, her dark eyes steady and unblinking. "You know what, boys?" Caldwell said, making a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I think our new friend here needs to understand how things work in the real world. Maybe a lesson in consequences would be educational for everyone involved."
Pete Garrison watched the confrontation unfold with growing horror. He had seen enough violence in Vietnam to recognize the signs of impending brutality, and Diana, despite her confident demeanor, was clearly outnumbered and outweighted. "Leave her alone, Caldwell. Your problem is with me, not her." "See, that's where you're wrong, Pete," Caldwell replied, taking on the lecturing tone of someone enjoying his moment of power. "My problem is with anyone who doesn't understand respect. This town needs to learn that when Trevor Caldwell makes an offer, smart people accept it gratefully." Diana allowed herself a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And what happens when smart people decline your generous offers?" "Accidents happen," Briggs answered, moving to flank Diana's left side. "Businesses burn down. People get hurt. Sometimes they disappear entirely. Life's unpredictable that way. Especially for people who don't have proper protection," Holden added, positioning himself to block Diana's path to the front door. "Lucky for you, we're in the protection business." The tactical situation was becoming clear to Diana's trained mind. Caldwell was the leader and primary decision-maker, but also the most cautious. He would hang back and let his subordinates handle the violence while maintaining plausible deniability. Briggs was the tactician, experienced enough to be dangerous, but overconfident in his abilities. Holden was pure muscle, dangerous in close quarters, but likely to rely too heavily on brute strength. Cross was the weak link, nervous and conflicted about the group's activities. "Protection from what?" Diana asked, genuinely curious about how Caldwell justified his criminal enterprise. "From us," Caldwell said simply, abandoning any pretense of legitimacy. "See, that's the beautiful thing about our business model. We identify potential problems before they become actual problems. Then we solve them. Permanently." Diana's expression never changed, but internally she was cataloging targets and calculating distances. The nearest improvised weapon was a heavy glass ashtray on a table 6 feet to her right. The bar's back exit was 12 feet behind her, but Holden was positioned to intercept anyone heading in that direction. The front door was 15 feet away, blocked by Briggs and Cross. "And if someone refuses your protection services?" she asked. "Well," Caldwell said, pulling out his phone to show Diana a series of photographs, "let me show you some recent examples of what happens to uncooperative business owners." The images were horrifying in their casualness. A restaurant kitchen destroyed by what appeared to be an accidental grease fire. A construction company's equipment yard after what the insurance report had labeled unexplained vandalism. A family-owned grocery store that had been gutted by a gas explosion that investigators had attributed to faulty connections. The Morrison family ran that grocery store for 3 generations, Caldwell explained with clinical detachment. Old man Morrison thought he was too proud to pay for protection. Turned out his pride wasn't worth much when the fire department couldn't save his building or his legacy. Diana studied the photographs with the analytical eye of someone who had investigated similar scenes in war zones. The damage patterns were too precise to be accidental. The timing too convenient to be coincidental. "How many families have you destroyed?" "As many as necessary," Briggs answered. "This is business, lady, nothing personal." "Actually," Diana said quietly, "it's about to become very personal." The change in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Where moments before she had sounded like a concerned civilian trying to defuse a tense situation, now there was something else. A cold, professional tone that spoke of experience with violence far beyond anything these men had encountered. Caldwell noticed the shift immediately. His survival instincts, honed through years of criminal activity, suddenly screamed warnings that his conscious mind couldn't quite process. "Who are you?" "Nobody important," Diana replied, her posture unchanged, but somehow radiating lethal potential. "Just someone who doesn't like bullies." Holden, too stupid to recognize danger when it stood 5 feet away from him, laughed and stepped closer. "Lady, you picked the wrong fight with the wrong people. We're professionals." Diana's smile was razor thin and completely without warmth. "So am I." The silence that followed was pregnant with violence. Pete Garrison instinctively ducked behind the bar, recognizing the calm before a storm that he remembered from firefights in the Mekong Delta. The elderly couple in the corner booth pressed themselves against the wall, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. Cross felt his stomach drop as he looked into Diana's eyes and saw something that reminded him of his worst nightmares, the cold, calculating gaze of someone who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. "Boss, maybe we should," he whispered urgently. "Shut up," Caldwell snapped, but his own confidence was beginning to waver. Something about this woman's stillness was triggering alarm bells that 20 years of criminal activity had taught him to trust. Diana took a slow, deliberate step forward, her movement fluid and controlled. "Here's how this is going to work, gentlemen. You're going to apologize to Mr. Garrison for threatening his business, then you're going to walk out of here and never come back." Briggs pulled a telescoping baton from his jacket, extending it with a sharp, metallic snap. "Or what, bitch? You'll call the cops? File a complaint? We own half the police force in this county." "No," Diana said softly, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded life-and-death situations. "I'm going to teach you what happens when predators encounter an apex predator." Holden charged first, his massive frame moving with surprising speed for someone his size. It was exactly the response Diana had been expecting. What happened next would be discussed in hushed whispers throughout Clearwater Falls for years to come.
Curtis Holden's charge was everything Diana had expected: powerful, direct, and completely lacking in tactical awareness. At 6'4" and 260 pounds, he relied on intimidation and brute force to overwhelm his victims before they could react. Against terrified civilians, this approach had never failed him. Against a Delta Force operative who had survived firefights in Afghanistan, it was essentially suicide. Diana sidestepped Holden's rush with minimal movement, her body flowing like water around his momentum. As he stumbled past, she drove her elbow into the nerve cluster just below his left ear. The strike was precise and devastating. Holden's massive frame crumpled to the floor like a marionette with cut strings, his nervous system temporarily scrambled by the perfectly placed blow. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Mason Briggs stared at his fallen colleague in shock, his telescoping baton suddenly feeling inadequate in his hand. He had been expecting a brief, brutal lesson in intimidation, followed by Diana's submission or retreat. Instead, his team's primary enforcer was lying unconscious on the floor, disabled by a woman who hadn't even appeared to exert herself. "What the hell?" Briggs whispered, his military training finally kicking in as he recognized combat skills far superior to anything he possessed. Trevor Caldwell felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. In 20 years of criminal enterprise, he had encountered plenty of resistance. Angry business owners, tough guys who thought they could fight back, even a few off-duty cops who tried to play hero. None of them had moved with the fluid precision he had just witnessed. This wasn't luck or desperation. This was professional training at a level that suggested military special operations. "Who are you?" Caldwell demanded, his voice tight with the first genuine fear he had experienced in years. Diana ignored the question, her attention focused on the tactical situation. Holden was down, but not permanently incapacitated. He would regain consciousness in a few minutes with nothing worse than a severe headache and wounded pride. Briggs was armed and positioned near the front door, blocking her primary escape route. Cross had backed against the wall, his face pale with shock. Caldwell remained near the bar, trying to process what he had just witnessed. "Ethan," Diana said quietly, addressing the youngest member of the group, "you look like someone who makes better decisions than your friends. Why don't you walk out of here while you still can?" Cross looked desperately between Diana and Caldwell, torn between self-preservation and loyalty to the man who had been paying his salary for the past year. I can't just—" "Yes, you can," Diana replied, her tone carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Walk away. Last chance."
Caldwell saw his crew's confidence cracking and knew he had to regain control of the situation. Nobody goes anywhere until we settle this. Briggs, take her down, now. Briggs advanced cautiously, his baton raised and ready. His military police training had taught him to be wary of opponents, who moved with Diana's confidence, but he was also acutely aware that his boss was watching. Failure here would mean the end of his lucrative position with Apex Protection Group. I don't know what kind of self-defense classes you took, lady, but Curtis was just caught off guard. I'm not going to make the same mistake. Diana shifted her stance slightly, weight balanced on the balls of her feet. To an untrained observer, she looked relaxed, almost casual. To someone with combat experience, her posture screamed lethal readiness. Mason Briggs, she said, surprising him by using his name. Former Army CID, dishonorably discharged for excessive force and evidence tampering. You spent 6 months in military prison before Caldwell recruited you. Briggs stopped advancing, his face going pale. How do you know that? I know a lot of things. I know that Apex Protection Group has been running a protection racket for 3 years. I know that you've been using arson, vandalism, and assault to force local businesses into paying for services they don't need. I know that at least 2 business owners have died under suspicious circumstances after refusing your demands. Caldwell saw the walls closing in around him. This wasn't just some random woman who had stumbled into their operation. This was someone with access to information that should have been buried in classified files and sealed court records. You're a cop, he said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't quite right. Cops didn't move like Diana had moved. Cops didn't have the kind of training that could drop a man like Curtis Holden with a single precise strike. Not exactly, Diana said, finally allowing herself a small smile. But I am someone who really doesn't like people who prey on veterans. The truth hit Caldwell like a physical blow. Pete Garrison was a Vietnam veteran. That much was common knowledge around town. But Diana's protective instincts suggested a personal connection to military service that went beyond civilian sympathy. You're military, Briggs said, his voice barely above a whisper. Was military, Diana corrected. Now I'm just a concerned citizen who thinks you gentlemen need to reconsider your career choices. Cross finally found his voice. Look, maybe we can work something out here. Nobody has to get hurt.
Curtis is already hurt, Diana pointed out, nodding toward Holden's unconscious form. The question is whether the rest of you want to join him. Caldwell's mind raced through his options. Retreating would damage his reputation and potentially encourage other business owners to resist his demands, but escalating the situation against someone with Diana's obvious skills could result in casualties he couldn't afford. What do you want? He asked finally. I want you to leave Mr. Garrison alone. Permanently. I want you to stop targeting local businesses, and I want you to find a new line of work that doesn't involve threatening innocent people. And if we refuse, Briggs asked, though his heart was no longer in the confrontation. Diana's expression never changed, but something in her eyes shifted, a predatory focus that reminded Caldwell of documentaries he had seen about apex predators selecting their prey. Then this becomes a very different kind of conversation, she said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Pete Garrison, watching from behind the bar, recognized the look in Diana's eyes from his own combat experience. It was the expression of someone who had killed before and was mentally preparing to do it again. You're threatening us, Caldwell said, though he was beginning to understand that the power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. I'm offering you a choice. The smart choice is to walk away. The alternative is to discover exactly what kind of training the military gave me before they turned me loose on the world. Holden groaned and stirred, his consciousness returning slowly. As he struggled to sit up, his eyes found Diana standing calmly in the center of the room, apparently unaffected by their confrontation. What happened? He mumbled, pressing his hand to his throbbing head. You learned why it's important to research your targets before engaging them, Diana said matter-of-factly. Caldwell realized that his entire operation, everything he had built over the past 3 years, was hanging in the balance. This woman represented a threat unlike anything he had previously encountered. Her calm confidence suggested resources and connections that could destroy him if he made the wrong choice.
But Trevor Caldwell hadn't built a criminal empire by backing down from challenges. He had survived and thrived by being more ruthless than his enemies, more prepared for violence than his victims. "Trevor," he said quietly, "call the others." Diana's expression didn't change, but she shifted her weight slightly, preparing for what came next. "The others?" Pete asked from behind the bar. "We've got 6 more guys outside in the parking lot," Caldwell said, his confidence returning as he remembered his numerical advantage. "See, we always bring backup to important meetings. Professional habit." Cross pulled out his phone, speed dialing a number with shaking hands. Within moments, Diana could hear car doors slamming outside and heavy footsteps approaching the bar's entrance. "Still feeling confident?" Caldwell asked, his predatory smile returning. Diana listened to the approaching footsteps, automatically counting and categorizing threats. 10 men total, unknown training levels, confined space with limited escape routes. The tactical situation had just become significantly more challenging. But as the front door opened and Caldwell's reinforcements began filing into the Rusty Anchor, Diana Novak felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years of civilian life. The familiar surge of adrenaline that came with being exactly where she belonged. The predators thought they had cornered their prey. They were about to discover that they had walked into the den of something far more dangerous than they could imagine.
The 6 additional men who entered the Rusty Anchor moved with the practiced coordination of a team that had worked together before. Diana's trained eye immediately catalogs their formation: 2 flanking the entrance, 2 moving to secure the bar area, and 2 positioning themselves to block the back exit. These weren't random thugs Caldwell had picked up off the street. This was a coordinated, tactical team with at least basic military or law enforcement training. "Gentlemen," Caldwell announced with renewed confidence, "I'd like you to meet our new friend here. She seems to think she can interfere with our business operations." The team leader, a scarred man in his 40s with the bearing of former special forces, studied Diana with professional interest. "Ma'am, I'm going to strongly suggest you cooperate with Mr. Caldwell's requests. We'd prefer to resolve the situation without anyone getting hurt." Diana remained perfectly still, her mind automatically shifting into the tactical assessment mode that had kept her alive through countless hostile encounters. 10 opponents, unknown weapons status, confined space with limited cover. The smart play would be surrender. No civilian should reasonably be expected to prevail against these odds. But Diane Novak had stopped being a civilian the moment she witnessed Caldwell's threats against Pete Garrison. "Before we continue," she said calmly, reaching slowly into her jacket pocket, "I think you should know who you're dealing with." Every man in the room tensed as Diana's hand moved, expecting her to produce a weapon. Instead, she pulled out a small leather wallet and flipped it open to reveal a military identification card. "Staff Sergeant Diana Novak, 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 combat deployments, Purple Heart recipient." The team leader's expression shifted from professional wariness to genuine concern. Rangers were elite infantry, trained to operate behind enemy lines and conduct high-risk missions that regular forces couldn't handle. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "with all due respect to your service, you're still outnumbered 10 to 1. We don't want this to escalate." Diana closed the wallet and returned it to her pocket, her movements deliberate and calm. "That's the thing about being outnumbered," she said conversationally. "It only matters if you're planning to fight fair." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the revelation that would change everything. "What my official record doesn't mention is that for 5 years I was attached to a unit that doesn't officially exist. We called ourselves the unit, though some people knew us by other names." The color drained from the team leader's face as understanding hit him like a physical blow. Every special operations professional knew the rumors about the unit. Delta Force, officially designated as 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, the most elite counterterrorism force in the American military, composed of operators who made Navy SEALs look like weekend warriors. "Jesus Christ," one of Caldwell's men whispered, taking an involuntary step backward.
My specialty, Diana said, her tone never changing from conversational, was precision marksmanship at extreme range. My confirmed kill count is classified, but I can tell you that I once eliminated a high-value target from 1,400 meters and a 40-mile-per-hour crosswind. Mason Briggs felt his telescoping baton slipped from nerveless fingers. He had been planning to attack a woman he thought was just another civilian. Instead, he was facing one of the most lethal snipers in military history. Of course, Diana continued, that was when I had my rifle. Today, all I have are the close quarters combat skills they taught me for situations exactly like this one. Trevor Caldwell realized that his carefully planned intimidation had transformed into a nightmare scenario. He wasn't facing a random Good Samaritan who had stumbled into his operation. He was facing a professional killer who had been trained by the finest military instructors in the world and hardened by years of combat against the most dangerous enemies on Earth. "You're bluffing," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. Diana smiled, and for the first time since entering the bar, her expression showed genuine amusement. "Am I?" She moved without warning, flowing across the room like liquid death. The nearest of Caldwell's reinforcements, a former police officer who thought his tactical training made him dangerous, found himself on the floor before his brain could process what had happened. Diana's hands had moved in a precise sequence that collapsed his windpipe temporarily, dropped him into unconsciousness, and relieved him of his concealed weapon in one fluid motion. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. "That's 2 down," Diana announced, calmly examining the pistol she had just acquired. 8 to go. The team leader, recognizing that the situation had spiraled completely out of control, made a desperate attempt to reassert authority. "Ma'am, please, we're all professionals here. There's no need for this to—" "Actually," Diana interrupted, "there's every need. You see, I've spent the last 3 years trying to adjust to civilian life, trying to find peace with the violence I've seen and caused. But watching you people threaten a Vietnam veteran in his own establishment has reminded me of something important."
She paused, her dark eyes sweeping across the room to make eye contact with each of Caldwell's remaining men. "Some people only understand one language, and I happen to be fluent in that language." Curtis Holden, still groggy from his earlier encounter with Diana's Elgo, struggled to his feet. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Caldwell snapped, his mind racing through increasingly desperate options. Retreat would destroy his reputation and potentially expose his organization to law enforcement scrutiny. But continuing to escalate against a Delta Force operator was tantamount to suicide. "Here's what's going to happen," Diana said, her voice taking on the unmistakable tone of someone issuing orders that would be obeyed. "Mr. Caldwell is going to apologize to Mr. Garrison for threatening his business. Then all of you are going to walk out of here and never return." "And if we refuse?" the team leader asked, though he already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. Diana's smile was razor-sharp and completely without warmth. "Then I'm going to demonstrate why Delta Force operators are prohibited from engaging in civilian law enforcement activities. We tend to generate too many casualties." The silence that followed was pregnant with violence. Every man in the room understood that they had crossed a line from simple intimidation into something far more dangerous. They were facing someone who had been trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation, someone who had operated in environments where mercy was a luxury that got people killed. Ethan Cross, the youngest member of Caldwell's crew, finally found the courage to speak. "Mr. Caldwell, maybe we should listen to her. This isn't what I signed up for." "None of us signed up for this," Briggs muttered, staring at his fallen colleague and wondering how a routine intimidation had transformed into a confrontation with military special operations. Caldwell realized that his authority was crumbling as his men began to understand the true nature of their opponent. Diana Novak wasn't just another obstacle to be overcome through superior numbers and firepower. She was an apex predator who had been temporarily domesticated, but never truly tamed. "What guarantee do we have that you won't come after us later?" Caldwell asked, grasping for some way to salvage the situation. "You don't," Diana replied, honestly. "But I will tell you this.
If I hear about Apex Protection Group threatening any more local businesses, if I discover that you've retaliated against Mr. Garrison in any way, or if you make the mistake of thinking this was a bluff, you'll discover exactly what a Delta Force operator can accomplish when she stops playing by civilian rules. The team leader made a decision that would save his life and the lives of his remaining colleagues. "We're done here," he announced, backing toward the door. "This mission is over." "Johnson, what are you doing?" Caldwell demanded. "I'm preventing a massacre," Johnson replied grimly. "Ma'am, we're leaving now. You have our word that we won't be back." As Caldwell's reinforcements began filing out of the bar, Diana maintained her position in the center of the room, the acquired pistol held with casual competence. Her message was clear. Anyone who wanted to continue the confrontation would have to go through her, and the cost of that decision would be measured in blood. Curtis Holden helped his unconscious colleague to his feet, supporting him as they stumbled toward the exit. Mason Briggs retrieved his fallen baton with shaking hands, never taking his eyes off Diana as he backed away. Only Trevor Caldwell, Ethan Cross, and Diana remained in the Rusty Anchor, along with Pete Garrison, who watched the proceedings with a mixture of awe and terror. The real confrontation was just beginning.
20 minutes after the last of Caldwell's reinforcements had fled the Rusty Anchor, the bar's parking lot filled with the flashing red and blue lights of the Clearwater Falls Police Department. Someone, probably one of the fleeing men, had called 911 to report a disturbance involving weapons and assault. What they hadn't mentioned was that the assault had been a one-sided demonstration of military special operations training. Diana sat calmly at the bar, the acquired pistol disassembled on the polished wood surface in front of her. She had field-stripped the weapon immediately after Caldwell's retreat, rendering it harmless while demonstrating her familiarity with firearms that went far beyond civilian training. Pete Garrison stood behind the bar, methodically cleaning glasses with hands that only trembled slightly. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the weapon and put your hands where I can see them," announced Officer Ryan Walsh as he entered the bar with his service pistol drawn. Walsh was a 10-year veteran of the Clearwater Falls PD, a competent officer who had never encountered anything more dangerous than domestic disputes and the occasional bar fight. Diana complied immediately, raising her hands and stepping back from the disassembled pistol. "Officer, I'm not armed, and I'm fully prepared to cooperate with your investigation." Walsh approached cautiously, his training warring with confusion as he tried to process the scene. Two men lay unconscious on the floor, Curtis Holden and the reinforcement Diana had disabled during her demonstration. Both showed signs of precisely applied trauma that suggested professional training rather than random violence. "Pete, what the hell happened here?" Walsh asked, though he kept his weapon trained on Diana. "Trevor Caldwell and his boys came in making threats. This lady here tried to defuse the situation, and things escalated from there." Detective Lisa Kane arrived 5 minutes later, her sharp eyes immediately cataloging the evidence scattered around the bar. At 35, Kane had worked her way up through the ranks of what was essentially a small-town police force, but her investigative skills had been honed through correspondence courses and conferences that exposed her to big-city crime techniques. "Officer Walsh, secure the scene. I want photographs of everything before we move those men for medical attention." She approached Diana with the cautious respect of someone who recognized that the situation was more complex than it appeared. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Kane. I understand there was some kind of altercation here tonight." "Detective, my name is Diana Novak. I'd like to report a criminal conspiracy involving extortion, threats of violence, and attempted assault." Kane raised her eyebrow. Most civilians involved in bar fights didn't use phrases like criminal conspiracy or speak with the precise diction that suggested formal training. "Before we get into details, I need to understand what happened to these men. The paramedics are saying their injuries are consistent with professional hand-to-hand combat training." Diana nodded toward the disassembled pistol. "I defended myself when multiple attackers threatened me with weapons. The weapon on the bar was taken from one of the assailants during the altercation." "You disarmed an armed attacker?" Walsh asked skeptically. "Among other things.
Diana replied simply. Detective Kane studied Diana's composed demeanor and military bearing, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. Ms. Novak, do you have any law enforcement or military background? I'm a retired Army Staff Sergeant. I served with the 75th Ranger Regiment. Kane examined the identification, noting the combat ribbons and overseas service bars that indicated serious military experience. Rangers were elite infantry, trained for missions that regular soldiers couldn't handle. That explains the hand-to-hand combat skills Kane used. But what doesn't explain is how the situation escalated to violence in the first place. Before Diana could respond, the bar's front door opened and Trevor Caldwell entered, flanked by two men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the confident arrogance of high-powered attorneys. Detective Kane, I'm here to file charges against that woman for assault with a deadly weapon, battery, and theft of private property. Kane turned to face Caldwell, her expression neutral but wary. She had heard rumors about Apex Protection Group's business practices, though nothing had ever been proven in court. Mr. Caldwell, I understand you were involved in tonight's incident. I'll need to take your statement. My client will be happy to provide a full account of tonight's unprovoked attack, announced the lead attorney, a silver-haired man whose business card identified him as Jonathan Pierce from Pierce, Whitman and Associates, one of Boise's most expensive law firms. Diana listened to Caldwell's version of events with the detached interest of someone who had heard enemy propaganda before. According to his account, he had been conducting a routine business meeting with Pete Garrison when Diana initiated violence without provocation, assault his employees with military-grade combat techniques, and stolen a legally owned firearm.
The evidence speaks for itself, Pierce continued. My client's employees are hospitalized with serious injuries inflicted by someone with specialized military training. This represents a clear case of excessive force used against civilians engaged in legitimate business activities. Detective Kane found herself caught between two conflicting narratives. Caldwell's story painted Diana as an unstable veteran who had used lethal military training against civilians. But Kane's instincts, honed through years of investigating domestic violence cases, told her that something was fundamentally wrong with Caldwell's account. Ms. Novak, Kane said carefully, do you have any evidence to support your version of events? Diana reached into her pocket and produced her smartphone. Detective, I have audio recordings of Mr. Caldwell's threats against Mr. Garrison, including explicit statements about arson, vandalism, and other criminal activities. The color drained from Caldwell's face as he realized that his carefully constructed narrative was about to collapse. She's lying. That recording is fabricated, taken out of context. We'll let the lab determine the authenticity of any recordings, Kane replied, accepting Diana's phone as evidence. In the meantime, I'll need statements from all parties involved. Pierce leaned close to Caldwell, whispering urgently in his ear. Whatever legal strategy they had planned was clearly failing to account for physical evidence that contradicted their client's story. Detective, Pierce announced, my client is prepared to offer Ms. Novak a generous settlement in exchange for dropping any charges related to tonight's incident. Kane's eyebrows rose. In her experience, innocent parties didn't offer settlements to their alleged attackers. Mr. Pierce, are you suggesting that your client committed acts that would warrant criminal charges? Not at all, Pierce replied smoothly, but my client is a businessman who prefers to resolve disputes efficiently rather than endure lengthy legal proceedings. Diana stepped forward, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Detective Kane, I want to file formal charges against Mr. Caldwell and his associates for criminal conspiracy, extortion, threats of violence, and attempted assault. I have evidence of a systematic pattern of criminal activity targeting local businesses. Pete Garrison finally found his voice. Detective, I'll testify to everything I witnessed tonight.
Caldwell threatened to burn down my bar if I didn't pay for protection services I don't need. Kane looked around the bar, taking in the evidence of violence, the conflicting stories, and the legal maneuvering that suggested this case was far more complex than a simple bar fight. Mr. Caldwell, you and your associates are not to leave the county without notifying this department. Ms. Novak, I'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to provide a detailed statement and surrender any evidence related to tonight's incident. As the police began processing the scene and interviewing witnesses, Diana realized that her confrontation with Caldwell was entering a new phase. The immediate physical threat had been neutralized, but now she faced something potentially more dangerous, a legal system that might not be equipped to handle the institutional corruption she had uncovered. Pierce pulled out his phone and made a series of quiet calls, speaking in the coded language of attorneys coordinating damage control. Within hours, every influential contact Caldwell had cultivated over the years would be mobilized to protect him from the consequences of his criminal enterprise. Diana Novak had won the first battle, but the war for justice was just beginning. And in small-town Idaho, where business relationships and political connections could override evidence and testimony, she was about to discover that some enemies were more dangerous in courtrooms than in back alleys.
The next morning brought revelations that transformed Diana's confrontation with Trevor Caldwell from an isolated incident into evidence of systemic corruption spanning 3 counties. Detective Lisa Kane arrived at the Clearwater Falls Police Department at 0600 hours to find her desk covered with reports that had been submitted overnight by businesses throughout southern Idaho. Word of Caldwell's confrontation with a Delta Force veteran had spread through the tight-knit community of small business owners like wildfire. Store owners, restaurant managers, and construction company supervisors who had been living in fear of Apex Protection Group suddenly found the courage to come forward with their own stories of extortion and intimidation. "Jesus Christ," Kane muttered as she reviewed the stack of incident reports. The pattern was consistent and damning. Caldwell's operation had been systematically targeting vulnerable businesses for at least 3 years, using threats of violence and property destruction to force compliance with their protection racket. Maria Santos, owner of Santos Family Restaurant, had been paying Apex Protection Group $500 monthly for 2 years after her kitchen had been destroyed by what insurance investigators had ruled an accidental grease fire. The timing of the accident, exactly 1 week after she had refused Caldwell's initial offer, had been coincidental, according to the official report. Tom Bradley, who ran Bradley Construction, had been forced to hire Apex Protection Group security for all his job sites after 3 separate incidents of equipment vandalism that had cost him tens of thousands in delays and repairs. The vandalism had stopped immediately after he signed Caldwell's contract. Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Officer Walsh, had been paying Apex Protection Group for security services at her clothing boutique since her store had been burglarized 3 times in 1 month. The burglaries had targeted only her most expensive inventory and had occurred despite the presence of security cameras that mysteriously malfunctioned during each incident. Detective Kane was building a case file that painted Apex Protection Group as something far more sinister than a legitimate security company. This was organized crime operating under the facade of legal business services, protected by carefully cultivated relationships with local officials and law enforcement. Her investigation hit its first major obstacle when she attempted to access Caldwell's business records through official channels. Judge Harold Morrison, who had presided over civil cases in Clearwater County for 15 years, denied her request for search warrants, citing insufficient probable cause. "Detective Kane," Judge Morrison had explained during their brief hearing, "Mr. Caldwell is a respected businessman with strong ties to the community. A few disgruntled customers and 1 violent incident involving an apparently unstable veteran do not constitute grounds for the kind of invasive investigation you're requesting." Kane left the courthouse with the growing suspicion that Judge Morrison's reluctance to authorize her investigation might be connected to more than just legal caution.
A quick review of public records revealed that Morrison's last two election campaigns had been partially funded by donations from Apex Protection Group and its subsidiary companies. Her suspicions were confirmed when she attempted to interview Curtis Holden and the other Apex Protection Group employee who had been hospitalized after their encounter with Diana. Both men had been transferred to a private medical facility in Boise, where they were being treated by doctors who refused to discuss their conditions with law enforcement. "I'm sorry, Detective," Dr. Richard Ashford had explained when Kane called the facility. "My patients have specifically requested that all medical information be kept confidential. They're exercising their legal right to privacy during their recovery." Kane knew obstruction when she encountered it. Someone with significant resources was coordinating a systematic effort to prevent her investigation from accessing key evidence and witnesses. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Alicia Brooks, a former military police officer who had served 2 tours in Iraq, walked into the police station at 1400 hours carrying a box of documents that would blow the Apex Protection Group conspiracy wide open. "Detective Kane," Alicia announced, "I understand you're investigating Trevor Caldwell. I think you need to see this." Alicia had been hired by Apex Protection Group 8 months earlier, recruited specifically because her military background lent credibility to their legitimate security operations. What she had discovered during her employment was evidence of criminal activity that went far beyond simple extortion. "Caldwell's been running parallel operations," Alicia explained, spreading documents across Kane's desk. "The legitimate security work is just a cover for systematic criminal enterprise. They've got files on every business owner in 3 counties, including detailed assessments of vulnerabilities and resistance potential." The documents Alicia provided were devastating. Internal memos discussing the optimal timing for accidents that would encourage cooperation, financial records showing payments to corrupt officials and contractors who specialized in untraceable arson and vandalism, personnel files on employees who had been recruited specifically because their criminal backgrounds made them perfect for intimidation work.
Most damning of all was a computer spreadsheet titled Resistance Assessment that categorized local business owners by their likelihood to report Apex Protection Group activities to law enforcement. Business owners were rated from compliant to high risk, with detailed notes about their personal vulnerabilities and potential pressure points. Pete Garrison's name appeared on the high-risk list with a notation that read, "Vietnam veteran, strong community ties, likely to involve law enforcement. Recommend immediate pressure campaign to secure compliance before resistance spreads to other targets." "This is evidence of criminal conspiracy," Kane said, photographing each document methodically. "Why are you bringing this to me instead of taking it to the FBI?" Alicia's expression darkened. "Because the FBI field office in Boise has been compromised. Special Agent David Park, who handles organized crime investigations, plays golf with Caldwell twice a month. I tried to report my concerns through official channels 3 weeks ago and was told that my allegations were unsubstantiated." Kane felt the familiar sensation of pursuing an investigation that led into increasingly murky waters. Caldwell's protection network apparently extended beyond local politics into federal law enforcement. "There's something else you need to know," Alicia continued. "Caldwell's been planning to expand operations into Oregon and Montana, but after last night's incident with Diana Novak, he's accelerating his timeline. He's convinced that word about his confrontation with the Delta Force operative will encourage resistance among his current clients and make new targets more difficult to intimidate." Kane studied the expansion plans Alicia had copied, noting the systematic approach that had characterized Caldwell's Idaho operations. New markets had been researched and categorized, potential targets identified and assessed, local officials and law enforcement contacts cultivated. "He's planning something desperate," Alicia said quietly. "Caldwell built his entire operation on the assumption that he could control situations through superior firepower and intimidation. Diana Novak proved that assumption wrong, and now he's panicking." "What kind of desperate?" Kane asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "The kind that involves eliminating threats permanently," Alicia replied. "Caldwell's got connections with people who specialize in making problems disappear. Diana Novak just became his biggest problem." Kane felt ice water replace the blood in her veins as she realized that Diana's confrontation with Caldwell had painted a target on her back that extended far beyond local law enforcement's ability to protect her. This wasn't just about stopping a protection racket anymore. It was about preventing a murder that would be disguised as an accident involving an unstable veteran who couldn't adjust to civilian life. She reached for her phone to call Diana's number, hoping to warn her about the escalating danger. The call went straight to voicemail. "Miss Novak, this is Detective Kane. I need you to call me immediately. Do not go anywhere alone, and do not trust anyone you don't know personally. We've discovered evidence that suggests you may be in immediate danger." As Kane hung up the phone, she realized that her investigation had uncovered something far more dangerous than a simple protection racket. She was looking at a criminal organization with the resources and connections to operate with virtual impunity, protected by corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government and federal law enforcement. Diana Novak had stirred up a hornet's nest that was about to unleash its full fury against anyone who threatened its existence. The question was whether Kane could build a case strong enough to stop them before they eliminated the one witness who could bring down their entire operation. Time was running out, and the stakes had just become a matter of life and death.
Diana Novak sat in her small cabin on the outskirts of Clearwater Falls, methodically cleaning her personal firearms while analyzing the tactical situation that had developed around her. The missed calls from Detective Kane, combined with the unusual activity she had observed around her property, told her everything she needed to know about Caldwell's next move. He was escalating from intimidation to elimination. Her cabin was strategically positioned on 20 acres of forested land with clear sight lines in all directions and multiple escape routes through terrain that would challenge any pursuit team. Diana hadn't chosen this location randomly. Every aspect of the property had been selected with defensive considerations in mind, including buried supply caches and communication equipment that operated independently of civilian infrastructure. The first ally to arrive was Major Douglas Reed, Diana's former commanding officer from Delta Force, who had driven straight through from Fort Bragg after receiving her encrypted message. Reed was a career special operations officer who understood that some threats couldn't be handled through normal channels. "Shadow," Reed said, using Diana's operational call sign as he surveyed her defensive preparations, "you've managed to step in some serious shit this time." "Sir, the situation escalated beyond my initial assessment," Diana replied, falling back into military formality. Apex Protection Group represents a significant criminal organization with law enforcement and judicial connections that compromise normal legal remedies. Reed studied the intelligence Diana had compiled on Caldwell's operation, noting the systematic approach that characterized professional criminal enterprise. This isn't just some small-town protection racket. This is organized crime operating at a level that threatens regional security. That's my assessment as well, sir, which is why I requested backup. The second arrival was Dr. Vanessa Crane, Diana's VA therapist, who had driven up from Boise after receiving Diana's cryptic phone call about complications with her civilian adjustment. Dr. Crane wasn't just a therapist, she was a former Army psychiatrist who had served in combat zones and understood the unique challenges faced by special operations veterans transitioning to civilian life. "Diana," Dr. Crane said, embracing her patient with genuine warmth, "when you said you were having difficulties adjusting to civilian life, this isn't what I expected." "Sir, the situation developed rapidly beyond my control," Diana explained. "I'm finding that some civilian problems require military solutions." Dr. Crane's clinical training allowed her to recognize the signs of someone who had transitioned from victim to hunter. Diana's posture, speech patterns, and tactical awareness indicated that she had psychologically shifted back into combat mode, a potentially dangerous development that needed careful management. "Diana, I need you to understand that revenge isn't therapy. Eliminating threats isn't the same as healing trauma. With respect, ma'am, this isn't about revenge. This is about stopping predators who are using civilian cover to continue operations that threaten innocent people." The third ally was unexpected. Stephanie Vale, an investigative journalist from the Idaho Statesman, arrived with a camera crew and enough background research on Caldwell's operation to fill a small library. Vale had been tracking Caldwell's operations for 6 months as part of a broader investigation into organized crime in the Pacific Northwest. Ms. Novak, Vale announced, I'd like to interview you about your confrontation with Trevor Caldwell, but more importantly, I have information about his criminal network that goes far beyond what local law enforcement has uncovered. Vale's research revealed that Apex Protection Group was part of a regional criminal syndicate with operations in Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Northern California. Caldwell answered to investors who remained hidden behind shell companies and offshore accounts, but whose resources allowed them to corrupt officials and eliminate obstacles with professional efficiency. They've been operating for 7 years, Vale explained, spreading photographs across Diana's kitchen table. At least 12 business owners who refused their services have died under suspicious circumstances. Car accidents, house fires, apparent suicides, all ruled accidental or self-inflicted by investigators who somehow overlooked obvious evidence of foul play. Major Reed studied the photographs with the analytical eye of someone who had investigated terrorist networks. This is enemy action, Shadow. These people represent a clear and present danger to civilian populations. The fourth ally arrived as the sun set over the Sawtooth Mountains. Jessica Torres, Diana's closest friend from her Delta Force days, had flown in from Seattle where she worked as a private security consultant. Torres brought with her a level of operational experience that matched Diana's own, along with resources that existed outside normal legal channels. Diana, Torres said, unpacking equipment that included military-grade communication systems and surveillance devices, you called for backup, and backup has arrived. Torres had spent the past 3 years building a network of former special operations personnel who specialized in problems that conventional law enforcement couldn't handle. Her clients included corporate executives threatened by organized crime, whistleblowers targeted for elimination, and civilians who had become victims of systematic criminal enterprises.
My research indicates that Caldwell's organization has been using a standard template for eliminating threats, Torres explained. They stage accidents that occur within 72 hours of initial contact, usually involving vehicle tampering or structural fires. The timing is designed to appear coincidental while ensuring that victims don't have time to establish protective measures. Detective Kane arrived as the tactical planning session reached its conclusion. Her unofficial presence indicated that local law enforcement was either compromised or ineffective, forcing her to seek solutions outside normal channels. Miss Novak, Kane said, I've uncovered evidence that Caldwell has contracted professional killers to eliminate you within the next 48 hours. Judge Morrison has refused to authorize protective custody, and my department lacks the resources to provide adequate security against the kind of threat you're facing. Detective, Major Reed interjected, what you're describing is enemy action against a decorated veteran who was defending civilian populations. This falls under federal jurisdiction related to domestic terrorism. Kane shook her head grimly. The FBI field office in Boise has been compromised. Special Agent Park is either corrupted or intimidated into inaction. Normal federal channels aren't going to provide assistance. Dr. Crane looked around the room at the assembled group of military veterans, law enforcement officers, and investigative journalists who had gathered to protect one woman from a criminal organization that operated with apparent impunity. Diana, you have to understand what's happening here. You've become the focal point for something much larger than your personal confrontation with Caldwell. These people see you as a symbol of resistance that could inspire others to fight back. Ma'am, I understand the symbolism, but my primary concern is stopping criminals who are preying on innocent civilians. Stephanie Vale pulled out her camera. Miss Novak, would you be willing to go on record about your experience with Apex Protection Group? A televised interview might provide protection by making your assassination too visible to attempt. Torres shook her head. Media exposure will just force them to escalate their timeline. We need to be proactive rather than reactive. Major Reed stood and moved to the window, scanning the darkening forest with the automatic vigilance of someone who had survived multiple combat deployments. Shadow, you've got 48 hours before they move against you. We can either wait for them to come to us, or we can take the fight to them.
Diana looked around the room at the allies who had gathered to support her fight against institutional corruption. Each brought unique capabilities that, when combined, represented a force that Caldwell's criminal organization would not be expecting. "Sir, what are you suggesting?" Reed's smile was sharp and completely without warmth. "I'm suggesting that it's time to remind some civilian criminals why they should be very careful about threatening Delta Force operators, even retired ones." The alliance was formed, the resources were in place, and the countdown to confrontation had begun. Trevor Caldwell had made the mistake of threatening someone who had spent her career eliminating threats to innocent people. Now he was about to discover that some wars never truly end. They just change theaters.
Trevor Caldwell's first mistake was underestimating the speed at which military special operations personnel could transition from defensive to offensive posture. His second mistake was assuming that Diana Novak's allies would limit themselves to legal remedies when facing an organization that operated outside the law. At 0200 hours, Caldwell was awakened in his luxury home outside Boise by the sound of his state-of-the-art security system being systematically disabled. The electronic locks, motion sensors, and cameras that had cost him $40,000 were being neutralized with professional precision by someone who understood exactly how such systems functioned. Jessica Torres materialized in Caldwell's bedroom like a ghost. Her night vision equipment and military-grade communications gear marked her as something far more dangerous than local law enforcement. "Mr. Caldwell," Torres said quietly, "you're going to get dressed and come with me. Any attempt to raise an alarm will result in immediate termination." Caldwell's mind raced through his options as he pulled on clothes with hands that trembled despite his attempts to project confidence. His personal security team was quartered in a separate building on his property, too far away to provide immediate assistance. His panic room was on the ground floor, accessible only if he could reach the hidden entrance without being shot. "Who are you?" he whispered, as Torres guided him through his own house with the confidence of someone who had thoroughly mapped the layout in advance. "I'm a friend of Diana Novak's, the woman you've been planning to murder." They exited through Caldwell's back door into a landscape that had been transformed into a tactical nightmare for anyone attempting to mount a rescue. Major Reed and two other former Delta Force operators had positioned themselves at strategic points around the property, equipped with military hardware that made Caldwell's private security look like amateur hour. The black SUV waiting in Caldwell's driveway was armored and equipped with communication jamming devices that would prevent any tracking or emergency calls. As Torres secured Caldwell in the back seat, he realized that his abduction had been planned and executed with the same precision that characterized military special operations. "Where are you taking me?" Caldwell demanded as the vehicle began moving through the pre-dawn darkness. "Somewhere we can have a private conversation about your business practices," Reed replied from the driver's seat. "Specifically, your plans to eliminate Ms. Novak and anyone else who threatens your criminal enterprise." The abandoned mining facility 40 miles north of Boise had been selected for its isolation and its symbolic significance. Diana wanted Caldwell to understand that his confession would be extracted in a place where his screams couldn't be heard, and his body would never be found if he proved uncooperative. When they arrived at the facility, Caldwell found himself facing a tribunal that represented everything he had been trying to avoid. Diana sat behind a folding table, flanked by Detective Kane and Stephanie Vale. Video cameras captured everything from multiple angles while Dr. Crane monitored his psychological state for signs of deception. "Mr. Caldwell," Diana began, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone conducting an interrogation, "you're going to answer questions about Apex Protection Group's criminal activities. Complete honesty will determine whether you leave here alive." Caldwell's expensive legal training warred with primal fear as he realized that normal legal protections didn't apply in his current situation. "This is kidnapping. You can't hold me here against my will." "Actually," Major Reed interjected, "we can do whatever we determine is necessary to protect innocent civilians from your criminal organization. You forfeited legal protections by operating outside the law." The interrogation that followed was methodical and devastating.
Diana's military training had included advanced interrogation techniques designed to extract information from enemy combatants who had been trained to resist questioning. Caldwell, despite his criminal experience, had never faced anything approaching this level of psychological pressure. Under questioning, he revealed the full scope of his organization's activities. 12 murders disguised as accidents over 7 years, systematic corruption of local officials and law enforcement personnel, financial networks that laundered money through legitimate businesses across 4 states, names, dates, locations, and methods that painted a picture of criminal enterprise that reached far beyond what any investigation had uncovered. The investors, Diana pressed. Who provides the capital for your operations? Caldwell's resistance finally cracked as he realized that his only chance of survival lay in complete cooperation. Marcus Kellerman. He runs a private equity firm in Seattle that specializes in acquiring distressed businesses. We provide the distress that makes them available for acquisition at below-market prices. Dr. Crane leaned forward, recognizing the significance of Caldwell's revelation. You're saying that your protection racket is just one component of a larger economic manipulation scheme?
Kellerman identified profitable businesses in secondary markets, Caldwell explained, his voice breaking as he betrayed his criminal partners. We create problems that force owners to sell quickly and cheaply. Kellerman's companies acquire the businesses through shell corporations, then resell them at massive profits once the criminal pressure is removed. Stephanie Vale's cameras captured every word of the confession, while Detective Kane documented evidence that would support prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions. But Diana's attention was focused on a more immediate concern. The contract on my life, she said quietly. Who did you hire, and when are they moving? Caldwell's face went pale as he realized that his confession had sealed his fate with his criminal partners. Anton Kozlov. He's a professional from the Russian mob who specializes in eliminating problems for organized crime. He arrived in Boise yesterday with a team of 3 operators. Where is he staying? Reed demanded. The Riverside Hotel under the name Anton Petrov. He's planning to stage your death as a vehicle accident tonight when you drive to your appointment with Detective Kane. Diana and Kane exchanged glances, realizing that Caldwell's criminal organization had been monitoring law enforcement communications and planning their assassination attempt around official police business. There's something else, Caldwell continued, his voice barely above a whisper. If anything happens to me, if I don't check in with Kellerman by noon today, he's activating contingency plans that include eliminating everyone connected to this investigation. Torres pulled out her satellite phone and began coordinating with assets that existed outside normal military channels. Within minutes, she had established contact with federal agents who operated in the gray areas between law enforcement and national security. Diana, Torres announced, we've got confirmation that Kozlov's team is already in position to intercept you, but we've also got federal resources moving to secure the primary targets in Seattle. Dr. Crane studied Caldwell's psychological profile, noting signs of complete psychological collapse that indicated his testimony was genuine. He's telling the truth about the timeline. We have less than 10 hours before this situation escalates beyond our ability to control it. Major Reed checked his equipment and communications gear, preparing for the kind of direct action that had characterized his military career. Shadow, we can either wait for Kozlov to come to us, or we can take the initiative and eliminate his team before they can complete their mission. Diana stood and moved to the window, looking out over terrain that reminded her of the mountains where she had spent years hunting enemies of the United States. The skills that had made her one of the military's most effective snipers were about to be tested in a civilian environment against professional killers who had no idea what they were walking into. "Sir," she said quietly, "I recommend direct action. It's time to remind some people why they should be very careful about threatening American veterans." The hunt was about to begin, and Trevor Caldwell was about to discover that some prey fought back with lethal efficiency.
Anton Kozlov had killed 43 people over 15 years of professional assassination work, each death carefully staged to appear accidental or coincidental. His reputation within organized crime circles was built on meticulous planning, flawless execution, and the complete elimination of evidence that could connect him to his victims. What he had never encountered was a target who possessed military special operations training and was actively hunting him. Diana positioned herself on the ridge overlooking Highway 21, the route Kozlov's intelligence indicated she would use for her fictitious meeting with Detective Kane. Her Barrett M82 sniper rifle, borrowed from Major Reed's private collection, was perfectly zeroed for the 800-meter shot that would eliminate the primary threat before his team could react. Through her scope, Diana watched Kozlov's three-man team prepare their ambush with professional competence that reminded her of enemy snipers she had hunted in Afghanistan. They had selected an optimal position where a curve in the highway would force vehicles to slow down, providing multiple angles of fire while offering concealment from passing traffic. Shadow, we have eyes on all three targets, Jessica Torres reported through the encrypted radio network they had established. Kozlov is positioned in the primary hide, approximately 600 meters from the kill zone. His spotters are flanking at 400 and 450 meters, respectively. Major Reed, positioned with a second team on the opposite side of the highway, confirmed the tactical assessment. Professional setup, but they're assuming their target will be driving through the kill zone rather than engaging from elevated positions. Classic asymmetric warfare mistake. Dr. Vanessa Crane monitored the operation from a mobile command post. Her role focused on ensuring that Diana's psychological state remained stable during what amounted to a return to active combat operations. Diana, remember that this is about neutralizing threats, not seeking revenge. Stay focused on the mission parameters. Stephanie Vale's camera crew was positioned at a safe distance to document the confrontation, though the footage would never be broadcast due to its classified nature. Her real purpose was to provide independent witness testimony that would support the legal proceedings that would follow. Diana's first shot was a thing of beauty that would have impressed her Delta Force instructors. The .5 caliber round crossed 800 meters in 1.2 seconds, striking Kozlov's center mass and eliminating him before his nervous system could register the impact. The sound of the shot echoed across the mountains like thunder, announcing that the hunt had begun. Kozlov's spotters reacted with professional discipline, immediately shifting to defensive positions while attempting to identify the source of sniper fire. Their military training was evident in their movement patterns, but they were operating under the fatal assumption that they were facing local law enforcement rather than elite military operators. Shadow, we have eyes on all three targets, Diana reported calmly, engaging secondary targets. The second shot was more challenging, requiring Diana to adjust for wind conditions and the increased range as Kozlov's team attempted to withdraw from their compromised positions. The round struck the spotter attempting to reach their vehicle, dropping him instantly with a shot that would have been impossible for anyone without Diana's level of training. The surviving team member made a tactical decision that signed his death warrant. Rather than continuing his withdrawal, he attempted to locate and engage the sniper who had eliminated his colleagues. His movement exposed him to Major Reed's position, where a former Delta Force operator was waiting with his own precision rifle. Reed's shot was clinical and final, ending the threat with the detached efficiency that characterized special operations warfare. The entire engagement had lasted less than 4 minutes, resulting in the complete elimination of a professional assassination team without civilian casualties or collateral damage. All targets neutralized, Reed reported. Area is secure for evidence collection. Detective Kane arrived at the scene with a forensics team that had been pre-positioned to process the evidence legally and thoroughly. Her role was to ensure that the elimination of Kozlov's team would be documented as justified self-defense rather than vigilante action. Ms. Novak, Kane announced for the official record, you and your associates engaged armed criminals who were attempting to commit premeditated murder. This represents clear-cut self-defense under Idaho state law. The investigation of Kozlov's team revealed evidence that connected them to organized crime activities spanning multiple countries. Encrypted communications on their phones provided intelligence about criminal networks that had been operating beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. But Diana's attention was focused on a more immediate concern. The elimination of Kozlov's team would trigger contingency plans that Marcus Kellerman had undoubtedly prepared for exactly this scenario. Torres, what's the status on the Seattle operation? Federal assets have Kellerman under surveillance, but they haven't moved to arrest him yet. Legal wants ironclad evidence before they act against someone with his political connections. Dr. Crane approached Diana as she disassembled her rifle with the automatic efficiency of someone who had performed the task thousands of times. Diana, how are you processing this return to combat operations?
Ma'am, it feels like coming home, Diana replied honestly. I've spent 3 years trying to adjust to civilian life, but this is what I was trained for. This is who I am. The psychological assessment worried Dr. Crane, but she recognized that Diana's return to military mindset might be necessary for survival in a situation that had escalated beyond civilian law enforcement capabilities. Stephanie Vale reviewed the footage her cameras had captured, noting that Diana's shooting demonstration would serve as powerful evidence of her military capabilities while documenting the professional nature of the threats she had faced. Miss Novak, Vale said, this footage proves that you were facing organized crime assassins with international connections. No jury will question your right to defend yourself against this level of threat. Major Reed studied intelligence reports that Torres was receiving through encrypted channels, his expression growing increasingly grim as he processed information about the larger criminal network they had exposed. Shadow, Reed announced, Kellerman's organization is bigger than we initially assessed. Seattle PD has identified at least 12 businesses that were acquired through similar intimidation tactics. We're looking at organized crime that operates at a level that threatens regional economic stability. Diana felt the familiar sensation of a mission expanding beyond its original parameters. What had begun as a simple confrontation with local criminals had evolved into something requiring sustained operations against a sophisticated criminal network. Sir, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that this mission isn't over until we've eliminated the entire criminal organization. Kellerman represents the head of the snake, and cutting off the head is the only way to ensure that this threat doesn't resurface. Torres received another encrypted communication that changed the tactical situation completely. Diana, we've got federal movement in Seattle. Kellerman's being arrested on charges related to conspiracy, money laundering, and murder for hire. But there's something else. What? He's claiming diplomatic immunity. Apparently, his organization has been providing intelligence to foreign governments about American business activities. This just became a national security issue. Diana realized that her confrontation with Trevor Caldwell had uncovered something far more dangerous than organized crime. She had stumbled into foreign intelligence operations that used criminal activity as cover for systematic economic removal, and the stakes had just escalated beyond anything she had imagined.
The federal courthouse in Seattle buzzed with the controlled chaos of a high-profile arrest that had national security implications. Marcus Tellerman sat in shackles, his expensive suit rumpled from his overnight stay in federal detention, while his team of high-powered attorneys struggled to navigate charges that spanned organized crime, foreign intelligence operations, and economic espionage. Diana watched the proceedings from the gallery, her presence both symbolic and tactical. As the woman whose confrontation with Trevor Caldwell had unraveled Kellerman's entire network, she represented the unlikely catalyst that had exposed foreign operations on American soil. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Officer Walsh from Clearwater Falls, presented evidence that painted Kellerman's operation as something far more sophisticated than organized crime. His private equity firm had been systematically targeting American businesses for acquisition, not just for profit, but to provide foreign intelligence services with detailed information about American economic capabilities and vulnerabilities. Your Honor, Walsh announced, the defendant's organization has been operating as an unregistered foreign agent while conducting economic warfare against American businesses. Mr. Kellerman's protection racket was merely the enforcement arm of a systematic intelligence-gathering operation. The evidence Jessica Torres had collected during their interrogation of Caldwell provided the foundation for charges that would keep Kellerman in federal prison for the rest of his life. But more importantly, it had exposed intelligence networks that reached into dozens of American businesses across multiple industries. FBI Special Agent Sarah Morrison, having replaced the compromised Agent Park, testified about the scope of Kellerman's foreign connections.
The defendant maintained regular contact with intelligence operatives from 3 different foreign governments, providing detailed assessments of American business capabilities, financial vulnerabilities, and technological innovations. Diana's role in exposing the conspiracy had earned her recognition that she never sought and attention that made her uncomfortable. But it had also demonstrated something important about the value of individual courage in confronting institutional corruption. Judge Patricia Williams, who had been specially assigned to the case due to her experience with national security matters, reviewed the evidence with the serious attention it deserved. Mr. Kellerman, the court finds sufficient evidence to hold you without bail pending trial on charges of conspiracy, money laundering, operating as an unregistered foreign agent, and conspiracy to commit murder. Kellerman's diplomatic immunity claims had been thoroughly debunked by State Department investigators who found no evidence of legitimate government authorization for his activities. His foreign intelligence contacts had abandoned him the moment his operations became public, leaving him to face American justice without protection. Trevor Caldwell, testifying under a plea agreement that would reduce his sentence in exchange for complete cooperation, provided devastating testimony about the systematic nature of Kellerman's operations. His detailed confession filled in gaps that had puzzled investigators for years. Mr. Kellerman provided us with target lists of businesses that foreign governments wanted information about, Caldwell testified, his voice hollow with the knowledge that his cooperation was his only chance of avoiding execution for treason. We would create artificial problems that forced quick sales, allowing Kellerman's companies to acquire businesses at below-market prices while gaining access to proprietary information. The impact on local communities had been devastating. 12 business owners had died over 7 years, their deaths staged as accidents to prevent investigation. Hundreds of employees had lost jobs when businesses were forced into bankruptcy by artificial problems. Entire families had been destroyed by economic warfare disguised as legitimate business practices. Dr. Vanessa Crane testified about the psychological impact on veterans like Diana, who had been forced to return to combat operations in civilian environments. Ms. Novak's response to this threat was consistent with her military training and the oath she took to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Detective Lisa Kane received commendation for her investigative work that had uncovered the local corruption enabling Kellerman's operations. Judge Harold Morrison and several other officials faced their own federal charges for accepting bribes and obstructing justice. Major Douglas Reed was quietly reassigned to a classified position that would allow him to pursue similar threats using military resources. His success in supporting Diana's operations had demonstrated the value of unconventional approaches to domestic security threats. Stephanie Vale's investigation earned her a Pulitzer Prize for exposing organized crime with foreign intelligence connections. Her documentation of Diana's confrontation with the assassination team provided crucial evidence for federal prosecutors. Pete Garrison reopened the Rusty Anchor with a security system donated by grateful business owners who had been freed from Apex Protection Group's extortion. His bar became an unofficial gathering place for veterans and community members who understood the value of standing up to institutional corruption.
But the most significant resolution came in the form of policy changes that would prevent similar operations from threatening American communities in the future. The Novak Protocol, as it became known, established new procedures for investigating protection rackets with potential foreign intelligence connections. Diana found herself testifying before congressional committees about the need for better coordination between local law enforcement and federal agencies when domestic crimes had national security implications. Her recommendations led to the creation of joint task forces that could respond rapidly to similar threats. Congressman, Diana testified during one particularly contentious hearing
The lesson of this case is that individual citizens have both the right and the responsibility to resist foreign operations on American soil. But they shouldn't have to face those threats alone. The financial recovery was substantial. Kellerman's assets, frozen by federal investigators, were used to compensate the families of murdered business owners and to rebuild businesses that had been destroyed by artificial problems. The economic warfare that had devastated communities for 7 years was finally reversed. Alicia Brooks, the whistleblower whose courage had provided crucial evidence, received federal protection and a new identity. Her decision to risk everything by exposing Apex Protection Group had saved countless lives and prevented foreign intelligence operations from expanding into other regions. Jessica Torres established a private security firm that specialized in protecting whistleblowers and investigating suspected foreign intelligence operations. Her network of former special operations personnel became an unofficial early warning system for similar threats. But perhaps the most important resolution was personal. Diana's successful transition from victim to protector to national security asset demonstrated that military training could be successfully adapted to civilian threats when supported by proper institutional frameworks. 6 months after the confrontation at the Rusty Anchor, Diana stood in the Rose Garden of the White House as the president awarded her the Medal of Freedom for her service in exposing foreign intelligence operations and protecting American communities. Diana represents the best of American values, the president announced. Her courage in confronting corruption and her skill in eliminating threats remind us that freedom requires constant vigilance and occasional direct action. As Diana accepted the medal, she thought about the path that had led from a simple confrontation in a small-town bar to recognition at the highest levels of government. The skills that had made her an effective sniper had proven equally valuable in protecting civilians from sophisticated threats. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but Diana understood that the real work was just beginning. Foreign intelligence operations would continue to threaten American communities, and protecting those communities would require constant vigilance from people willing to act when institutions failed. The war for American security was far from over, but at least now there were protocols in place to ensure that future Diana Novaks wouldn't have to fight alone.
5 years after the confrontation at the Rusty Anchor, the small town of Clearwater Falls had become an unlikely pilgrimage site for veterans, law enforcement officers, and civilians who understood that individual courage could catalyze institutional change. The bar itself had been preserved exactly as it was on the night Diana Novak faced down 4 men who thought they could intimidate a retired Delta Force sniper. Diana stood behind the podium at the newly constructed Novak Center for Veteran Affairs, addressing an audience of military personnel, federal agents, and community leaders who had gathered for the annual conference on domestic security threats. At 43, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had successfully transitioned from warrior to teacher while maintaining the tactical awareness that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. When people ask me about that night 5 years ago, Diana began, her voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium, they often focus on the physical confrontation, the combat skills, the tactical advantage, the elimination of immediate threats. But the real victory wasn't won through violence. It was won through the decision to document evidence, build alliances, and pursue justice through institutional channels. The Novak Protocol had been implemented across all 50 states, establishing joint task forces that could respond rapidly when local crimes showed indicators of foreign intelligence operations. The protocol had already prevented 12 similar operations from taking root in American communities, protecting thousands of business owners from the kind of systematic intimidation that had terrorized southern Idaho. Major Douglas Reed, now Colonel Reed, and commanding officer of the newly created Domestic Security Task Force, provided the keynote address about institutional adaptation to emerging threats. The lesson of the Caldwell-Kellerman conspiracy is that foreign intelligence operations have evolved beyond traditional espionage into economic warfare that targets the foundation of American prosperity. Diana Novak's response demonstrated that our defense must evolve as well. The audience included Jessica Torres, whose private security firm had grown into a nationwide network of former special operations personnel who specialized in protecting whistleblowers and investigating suspected foreign operations. Her success had inspired similar organizations that provided civilian populations with access to military-level expertise when conventional law enforcement proved inadequate. Dr. Vanessa Crane presented research about the psychological impact of returning to combat operations in civilian environments. Ms. Novak's case study demonstrates that military training can be successfully adapted to domestic threats when supported by proper institutional frameworks and therapeutic intervention. The key is channeling warrior skills toward protective rather than destructive purposes. Detective Lisa Kane, now Chief of Police for Clearwater Falls, had used her experience investigating Apex Protection Group to develop training programs that helped local law enforcement identify protection rackets with foreign intelligence connections. Her department had become a model for rural police forces dealing with threats that exceeded their traditional capabilities. But the most significant long-term impact was generational. Young veterans entering civilian life now had access to support networks that understood the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian mindset while maintaining the tactical skills that could protect their communities when needed. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, no relation to the restaurant owner, represented the new generation of veterans who had been trained specifically to recognize and respond to domestic security threats. Ms. Novak's example taught us that military service doesn't end with discharge. We have ongoing responsibilities to protect the civilian populations we swore to defend. The economic impact had been equally significant. The businesses that had been acquired through Kellerman's artificial distress tactics were restored to their original owners or their families. The economic recovery in southern Idaho had become a case study on how communities could rebuild after systematic criminal targeting. Pete Garrison, now in his 70s but still operating the Rusty Anchor, had become an unofficial spokesman for small business owners who refused to be intimidated by organized crime. His bar hosted monthly meetings of the Business Owners Protection Association, an organization that provided resources and mutual support for entrepreneurs facing similar threats. Stephanie Vale's continued investigative work had exposed 3 additional foreign intelligence operations in different regions of the country. Her Pulitzer Prize-winning series on economic warfare had educated the American public about threats they never knew existed. Alicia Brooks, living under federal protection with a new identity, had become a consultant for government agencies investigating foreign intelligence operations. Her expertise in recognizing the signs of systematic criminal infiltration had prevented numerous similar conspiracies from developing.
Trevor Caldwell had died in federal prison 3 years earlier, apparently from complications related to diabetes, though some investigators suspected that his former foreign intelligence contacts had arranged his elimination to prevent further testimony. His death served as a reminder that betraying foreign intelligence operations carried risks that extended beyond American justice. Marcus Kellerman remained in federal prison, serving consecutive life sentences for conspiracy, murder for hire, and operating as an unregistered foreign agent. His appeals had been systematically rejected by federal courts that found overwhelming evidence of his criminal activities and foreign connections. As Diana concluded her address, she looked out over an audience that represented the institutionalization of individual courage, the protocols, training programs, and support networks that had grown from her confrontation with 4 criminals in a small-town bar demonstrated that democracy's strength lay not in its institutions, but in the individual citizens who demanded that those institutions live up to their founding principles. The greatest lesson of the Apex Protection Group case, Diana said, is that foreign enemies understand something that we sometimes forget.
American strength isn't measured in military hardware or economic statistics. It's measured in the willingness of individual citizens to stand up for what's right, even when they're outnumbered and outgunned. After the conference, Diana drove through the streets of Clearwater Falls, noting the subtle changes that had transformed the community over 5 years. New businesses had opened, confident that they wouldn't face systematic intimidation. Veterans had moved to the area, drawn by a community that understood the value of military service and the challenges of civilian transition. The Diana Novak Memorial Bridge, named not because she had died, but because her actions had bridged the gap between military and civilian communities, carried traffic over the Snake River toward a future where foreign intelligence operations would find American communities prepared and protected. That evening, Diana sat on the porch of her cabin, performing the same Tai Chi routine she had practiced on the morning before her life changed forever. The movements flowed with the same precision, but their meaning had evolved from personal meditation to preparation for ongoing service. Her phone buzzed with a secure message from Colonel Reed. New situation developing in Colorado. Protection racket with possible foreign connections. Local law enforcement requesting consultation. Are you available? Diana finished her Tai Chi routine and reached for her equipment bag, checking the tactical gear that she maintained in constant readiness. Some wars never truly ended. They just found new battlefields where individual courage could make the difference between freedom and subjugation. As Diana prepared for another mission, she thought about the 4 men who had cornered what they thought was just another small-town woman in a rural bar. Their mistake had catalyzed changes that would protect American communities for generations to come. The dragon was still awake, still watching, still ready to remind foreign enemies that some Americans refuse to be intimidated, no matter how long the odds or how sophisticated the threat. The legacy of that night at the Rusty Anchor would endure as long as individual citizens possessed the courage to fight for the principles that made America worth defending. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.